Hello, hello. Welcome to Chapter 3, Organizational Design and Coordination. Today we'll be chatting for just a few minutes about organizational structures and how the manner in which we design organizations really dictates how work functions, how teams come together, how we set expectations and manage professionals. It is our guide for everything that we do: flow of information, results-oriented progress, all of it. So, organizational design is so important because strong empirical evidence, data for many years has shown us that our coordination, the way that we set up teams, is tied to patient outcomes and financial success. And so, we want to design our organization in a manner that encourages communication and that empowers folks to do their work. Organizations are complex, right? We know that already at this point in the course, and we know that any structure will have its benefits and its limitations based on how we set up reporting, how we share information, who works with who on a daily basis. So there's two structural issues we have to keep in mind when we think about configuring an organization. One of those is differentiation. Are we focusing each organizational part on a specific role? Do we have nursing separate from radiology? Or do we have a breast center in which they both work together providing care for breast cancer patients, right? So we have to think about the choice to integrate service lines and create those patient-oriented services, or do we have strongly differentiated structures? And sometimes a little bit of both. Now, at the macro level, at the high level, we have to think about how our work is interconnected and how we can manage task uncertainty, making sure everyone knows expectations. One of the big drivers for how we scaffold and build organizations is the size. Smaller organizations may have different structures than larger organizations and need different layers and different types of support. The ways in which we share resources is another big component. Now, as far as approaches to coordination, we have to think about the hierarchy. So we have to think about who's reporting to whom, who's my boss, who's my supervisor. We have to think about rules and procedures that dictate certain processes and the way certain roles and programs function. We have to think about who's in charge of planning and goal setting, and then how we handle the sharing of information both laterally across and vertically up and down. How do we get information from our higher ups, if you will, or our C-suite? Now, this is a quick graphic that talks about three organizational structures, and you may want to choose to pause here for a second and just take a look at these. We've got functional, projectized, and matrix. Now, these are classic structures. However, sometimes we call them different things. So you'll notice later on other slides, the projectized might be referred to as a program structure. So it's a project or a program structure. In this case, those words are used interchangeably, although a project is normally a smaller effort than a program. But we're talking about effort-based, offering-based organization. So in our first situation here, we have functional. So that would be nursing staff reporting to a director of nursing. Below that, we have projectized. So we may have nursing staff that are reporting to a heart health manager who runs a cath lab and a cardiac clinic. Under matrix, this is a hybrid of both, where you may, in a matrix structure, have both a functional leader and a project-based leader. So you may almost have two bosses, if you will. Now, this is an example of a partial organization, but this is a strict functional view of a nursing department in a hospital. We've got a vice president of nursing, a VP of nursing. We've got specialty units, medical units, surgical units. So we've got critical care, medical, surgical care, all reporting up in a very classic functional, is the key word, hierarchical structure. Now you'll see here's some other simple organizational structures where you'll see we've got a leader who's marked as I, we've got G and H reporting up. In the top one, we've got A, B, C, D, E, F. But in the other one, we've got A, C, D, B, E, F. And what that means to imply is that sometimes it may have a fairly functional flow, but you may have someone that might traditionally report up through, maybe they're a nursing department, so you would expect them to report up through the nursing hierarchy, but instead they're reporting up through IT because they're a group of nurse clinical informaticists. Something about this has changed slightly in the flow, but it's still hierarchical. It's not a matrix. It's not based on projects. Still fairly functional, but something changed in an unexpected way. And this is typical. Every organization is different. So we expect some slight variation. This is a continuum. So I just described 3 frameworks. Again, a very project or program service line oriented structure where everyone is grouped around a certain type of patient or a certain type of service versus a role-based structure, nursing, pharmacy, radiology, versus a matrix where you have a little bit of both. You're working on certain projects. You may have a project manager or a project level supervisor, and then you'll have your functional supervisor. Those are 3 common, but the truth is it's a spectrum. Going from focused either on clear differentiation in your roles or on as being integrated as possible, wrapping around the patient in an interdisciplinary team where we all report to the same manager providing that group of services. So we've got differentiation, we've got integration, and we've got a continuum here going from traditional functional relationships and hierarchy all the way through program service line hierarchy. Now, to make this make a little more sense on this next slide, we have an example of a functional organization. And if you look, we've got our CEO, VP of HR, we've got our CFO, we've got our clinical and our non-clinical departments, we've got our support services, but the whole flow makes sense. Pharmacy reports to the VP of Professional Services, who reports to CEO. Everyone in pharmacy is in that line. The next slide here, though, this is a program-based organization. So instead of having nursing in their own category, we might have cardiology. And within cardiology, there's nurses providing cardiac care, right? There's therapy and other folks, cath lab staff under cardiology, right? It's not just a functional path. So this is a program, or what we saw before, more projectized, more service line oriented structure. Now, next we have our matrix organization. This shows we've got the heart program manager and the VP of nursing. Nursing would be the functional, heart program manager would be that program projectized viewpoint. And then we've got the nurse manager of cardiology. And if you look, the nurse manager of cardiology has 2 bosses. They report to the VP of nursing as a nurse through a functional support line. And then they report to the heart program manager as well. And so you see that there. This is matrix. Another example of classic matrix, and I've linked in a YouTube video that might be helpful explaining this, is what we see happen a lot in human resources, finance, IT, marketing, areas where I may work in IT and I'm a server engineer that reports to the director of IT infrastructure, but I also work on a project for some of the clinical units. So there's a dotted line to either a project manager, a program manager, someone on the clinical side. So that's very common, and we see that in HR too. For example, if I'm the director of nursing, I may have an assigned HR analyst who handles all the requisitions, the job stuff for nursing. That person reports to the director of HR, but they also report to me and update me as the director of nursing. Those dotted lines in many directions, or at least 2, that's a matrix organization. And you'll see that we don't always have to have it perfect. It doesn't have one or the other. So this is a modified program structure. If you look at this structure, some of it's a functional structure and some of it's based on services that are provided. Some of it's based on cardiology, cardiac surgery, those services. Other areas feel a little more functional, basic. So this is a modified program structure that has some of both elements. Now, when we think about coordinating services at the macro level, we have to think about line and staff positions and what authority folks have to make decisions in their roles and how we can empower folks. There's a lot of data that's shown, and sometimes we don't love this when we're cutting costs or tightly managing processes, but the lower level in an organization with which you can be making decisions, the more efficient you'll be. If something needs the CEO's signature, that's going to take a while, versus if a manager can sign off on it, it will move forward more quickly. Right? Again, we're talking about efficiency, speed, making sure they're trained appropriately and they're making the right decisions is a whole other conversation. So we've got these line and staff positions. We also have to realize that we're working in healthcare, where I just showed you the layout of a few different single systems, but we work now with integrated delivery systems, where we may have 10 hospitals working together with a health plan, with outpatient providers, with therapy providers, and outpatient surgery centers, and all these things coming together. And that changes and broadens the scope of what that hierarchy looks like, what reporting relationships can look like. I've also used this bottom term a few times already, service lines. The idea of having a heart program, a heart center, a cancer center, we call those service lines. They're a grouping of service offerings and staff doing that work around a specific disease, condition, or population. And so when we do that, that is a very program-based, a service line, a program-based structure. So lots of terminology that is seen similar. Now, one of the key decisions for how we scaffold and build organizations is whether or not we want to centralize or decentralize. And that is key. It is pivotal to our success to know whether we want a consolidation of power or more decentralized. For example, if we make those decisions at a lower level in an organization, if a manager can sign off on up to a $10,000 expense, we call that vertical decentralization. Vertical is the hierarchy up and down, right? And we're allowing for more work to be done at a lower level. Now, sometimes we have parallel organizations. We may be working as a hospital and we have an affiliated medical staff organization that the physicians work for. That adds complexity too. That's unique to healthcare. Now, there's lots of different structures. Sometimes we have these hybrid structures that are part functional, part programmatic. And organizations can have multiple goals. And as their goals change, the structure might change. The other thing that makes healthcare very specific and different is we have something called the three-legged stool of administration. And again, this is specific to hospitals normally. Hospitals are required to have administration, right? We have a CEO, a CFO, people running the organization. We also have a medical staff, right? With a chief medical officer and a group of physicians. And we have a board, a governing board that dictates the strategy, the strategic direction for our hospital. And that might be made up of community members or other industry experts. So we have this board, we have our management team, CEO, CFO folks, and our physician group. So 3 legs to this stool, and everybody has to get along and collaborate to be effective. Now, at a micro level, we have some other considerations, right? How do we create our own departments in ways that we're assigning roles to different individuals and groups in a way that gets them to mesh and work together effectively? And you may choose to have part of your department be more projectized, more program level. And I'll give you a silly example. Early on in my career, I've worked for years with my husband, and early on in my career, him and I were 2 analysts on a 4-analyst team. And this is before we dated or got married. But we were 2 of 4. And he was a supply chain clinical analyst. I was a clinical data analyst doing quality data. We had a financial analyst and a cost accounting analyst. And we all had our own little domain. Well, at one point, our boss got the crazy idea that instead of us each working on different data, my husband did supply chain, I did clinical quality, and then we had finance and cost accounting. Instead, let's all do everything, but for a certain service line. So I, for example, would be responsible for all the cost accounting, all the financial data, all the supply chain, and all the quality information, data, performance outcomes for the cancer center. And I would be the cancer center's person, but do everything. That is a very over-the-top, silly example of a program level function. That would never work, right? Because you need the functional. You need finance separate from quality data. You need finance and supply chain separate. But in some cases, we have a financial analyst who works in and only supports a service line. And that does make sense. So how we organize how we organize our organizations is based on the needs of the departments, and often sometimes just based on the personalities, who gets along well, who learns certain skills, right? It can be very micro, it can be very personal. Now, oftentimes we're thinking about how we can standardize work processes, standardize skills, and train folks. And that's where a traditional hierarchical functional organization works really well, because you can have those clear rules, guidelines, competencies that are based on a role, such as nursing. It's really important, though, when we start to think about coordination, that we take time to provide feedback in our organizations on what's working and what's not. That's a very time-consuming process, but we have to realize that if we're going to have elaborate program-based organizations where we're all working to serve a certain patient population and we have multiple reporting structures, that's going to take a lot of effort versus just a traditional functional structure. If I have two bosses, like in a matrix organization, that's going to take time. And so we want to make sure that we're providing that structured due diligence. We're making sure we reflect and share with our supervisor if it's working or not, what makes sense for reporting relationships. We also want to make sure that we understand this relational coordination aspect, who we report to and how that influences how we work with other teams, how we form shared goals and shared knowledge and mutual respect. Now, a good example of great integration is the Veterans Health System. The Veterans Health System decided to do this huge redesign, and myself and Dr. Sikowski are research scientists at the VA, and so we do a lot of work with veterans and with the VA health system as part of our work at App State. But anyways, the VA is going through this huge restructuring, or went through this huge restructuring rather, where they wanted to combine their disparate different hospitals, clinics into 22 regional networks with a hierarchy at the region level, and they have disease-oriented hospital-based care where everyone knows who reports to who, and they have these various regions established. And it's been very successful. They've seen remarkable improvement. Can't talk today. Oops. Remarkable improvement in 9 of 17 quality indicators skyrocketed after they did this work to align. And it meant that they were having a program level approach, right? They have this disease-oriented care where they have neurology and oncology. They have it separated, but it's within this regional model where then they have functional leadership at the top. All right. Well, I hope this short lecture was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions. And I look forward to seeing all your reflection on the content.